Hey, I'm David, and this is Adobe UXP Things You Need to Know number nothing. It's some sort of a special episode of the series, a presentation titled UXP Landscape Guide, mapping your learning journey through Adobe extensibility. Okay, let me tell you what this is all about. Talking to developers, especially those who are new and are approaching this Adobe extensibility thing, I came to realize that they spend a huge amount of energies trying to just understand the shape of this thing. So I wanted to give you a description of this Adobe extensibility layer, which hopefully is going to inform your learning path. And beware that this presentation is going to be unscripted, so possibly much longer than the previous videos. Deliberately unsophisticated and occasionally rantish, which is basically my description. Okay, that said, my goal is for you to have a proper understanding of the implication of your idea that you want to make a UXP plugin, which is a great idea, by the way, especially in terms of your learning experience, what you have to learn first, and then second, and then third, and stuff that you must just be aware of. Let me now, in great detail, guide you through the various kinds of various technologies that are part of this Adobe extensibility layer. So in a nutshell, there is scripting on the one side, and then stuff that makes use of scripting on the other, and in doing so, extending the reach and the features and the power of it enormously. Okay, so let's start with scripting first, which is a way to programmatically drive a host application, and by host application I mean Photoshop, InDesign, Premiere Pro, After Effects, whatever, with code. And it's really important to have clear what the reach of scripting is, what it can do or what it cannot do. So the UI, the user interface, is like 99.9% of the times the superset of the possibilities. What do I mean? If there is something that you, as a human using the application, can do through the user interface, the menus, the buttons, the panels, whatever, then theoretically scripting can do the same. And keep in mind that as a robot user, scripting is much quicker and much more precise than humans. So let me give you an example. You want to, create a layer in a document. Can you do that as a human? Yes, you can. You can just use the menus and perform that task. So this is something that is theoretically and practically in the realm of possibilities of scripting. A bit harder, you want to create a tool that doesn't exist. Let's say that you want to create a star selection tool in Photoshop. You have rectangular selection, ellipse selection, polygonal selection, rows and columns. You want to create something that is star-like. Can you create something that doesn't exist? In a way you can, because if you are precise enough, you can use the polygonal selection tool, and then each time the user clicks something, then you very quickly draw that star. So yes, this too is within the realm of possibilities of scripting. Let's say instead that you have built some sort of Raspberry Pi camera that outputs some strange file format, and then you want to import this into Photoshop. Can scripting do that? Well, can you with the UI do this? No. So it's theoretically outside of scripting's reach. So it's not something that you can do. So to sum up, scripting can do stuff that you can do using the user interface, being much quicker and precise than you, but not stuff that you cannot do, that you wouldn't be able to do yourself. And this is the theory. So this is the absolute superset. Now let me introduce you to the concept of the DOM, the Document Object Model, which is the structure of object and nested objects and properties and methods, so actions, that describe what this scripting's realm is. Let's say, again, that you want to create a document and then access a layer and then possibly modify the opacity of that layer. So in a way, with code, you have to access the application, and then inside the application, one of the various open documents, and inside that document, one of the various layers that it has, and then tweak the opacity. So you have to say app, and then at some point some document, and then some layer, and then the opacity, the kind, whatever. This structure that is provided to you as a developer is the DOM, the Document Object Model. And now comes the tricky part, this notion of DOM coverage. That is to say, the fact that the DOM has not been built by Adobe engineers to really do everything that is in the realm of possibilities for scripting. For instance, there are features that you cannot script. Adobe Camera Raw as a filter comes to mind, or gradient tool, for instance, stuff that you could do using the user interface, but you cannot do through code. Why? Well, you're asking to the wrong person. In theory, if Adobe should provide a complete DOM, in practice, it never does. It's not 100%, not even close in Photoshop, but that depends on the application that you work in. In Photoshop is something I would say from 60 to 70% complete, maybe. InDesign might be better or different. Frankly, I don't know. So if something is not in the DOM, is not something that scripting can act upon. But Photoshop has a trick up his sleeve. This event system, something that was used to be called Action Manager, nowadays called Batch Play, same thing. An event system that is at the base of actions, that allows you to use a very ugly and dangerous, in a way, syntax and reach those features that the DOM cannot reach. Not everything that is in the UI is reachable through Batch Play and Action Manager, but a good deal more than the DOM does. This is Photoshop only, but we'll get to that later on. And speaking of the language, finally, that you use to write this scripting code, it used to be ExtendScript before UXP. Now it is modern JavaScript. ExtendScript is a flavor of JavaScript, if you will. It's based on an old JavaScript specification, like 1999 old, that Adobe has additioned with some fancy stuff like libraries for UI and XML literal support. While nowadays we use modern JavaScript. It's not that modern JavaScript is the evolution of ExtendScript. They're kind of cousins, like they share the same ancestor like us and the chimps. I hope we all agree with that. So we use finally modern JavaScript nowadays. And everything that is not what I've talked to you about, this scripting thing, makes use or includes scriptings. This is true for everything that is UXP related. I'm not talking about C++ plugins. This is not my audience. And let's now talk about one of those technologies that embed scripting, the CEP, the Common Extensibility Platform, which is the technology before UXP and the one that is, in theory, fading out. In practice, it's still very much relevant because UXP is available to third-party developers in Photoshop and Adobe XD, in part also to InDesign, but that's it, nothing in other major applications. So if you have the urge to develop something nowadays for Premiere Pro, then you have to use CEP. Technically is a merge of the Chromium Embedded Framework, which is basically the Google Chrome browser, and Node.js. Node.js, if you've lived in a cave in the last, I don't know how many years, is a JavaScript engine transplanted outside of the browser so that you can write JavaScript code without the need to be in the context of a web page. In other words, with CEP, you were writing web applications that made use of this powerful JavaScript engine with a bunch of libraries that you could grab, made by a large community to, I don't know, fetch data from the internet, write to disk, and so on and so forth. The pros of CEP, for sure, it was, still is a standard. That is to say, as standard as browsers the Chrome browser is, and very, very rich environment. And also it made use of ExtendScript, which is a robust, or at least very well known, since it's been around for more than 20 years, language for the scripting. Speaking of the cons, well, you had a very high performance footprint on the system. And you might object that, hey, I'm just making this little panel. How slower would it make Photoshop or InDesign? Well, you have to think about the fact that Adobe has kind of outsourced some features, some first-party features of those main applications to CEP panels. So CEP panels for first-party use. For instance, the welcome screen used to be a CEP panel. The new file dialog was a CEP panel. And so you were running all those panels without, properly knowing that they were. And so each hit on the performance of the application was important to Adobe. So this is a problem that they had to solve. Something that you might have had more experience with in terms of downsides of the CEP technology is that you had to deal with two different engines. So think about this panel of yours that you're building. Then you have this UI, the buttons, the fields, the stuff that the user interacts with. This is driven by a modern JavaScript engine, but at some point your plugin has to tap into scripting in order to do something relevant to the host application, to InDesign, to Illustrator, to Photoshop. And then it has to use scripting. And so it has to use the ExtendScript engine. And so talking back and forth these two engines was quite cumbersome for us developers, and there was a lot of room for improvement in this department here. So CEP, the common extensibility platform, in theory is fading out. In Photoshop is surely almost unusable, especially if you have modern Apple Silicon M1, M2 machines, because you have to run it. If you want to still use CEP extensions, you have to run Photoshop in Intel emulation mode, and nobody wants to tell that to their clients. So as a matter of fact, it's dead. In other applications, still somehow relevant, but the transition to UXP is inevitable. So finally, we get to UXP, the unified extensibility platform. CEP was common, now we are unified. I hope you are familiar with this thing, being someone who watches my videos. This is the in-house solution to the CEP problems that we have just talked about, especially in terms of performances. UXP is much lighter. Adobe can afford to make more and more features, first-party features, through UXP without affecting your computer performances so much. Speaking of other upsides of the platform, it's much safer. It's a sandbox environment. So many people didn't realize, but you could wipe out the entire hard drives of your users with scripting and CEP. Now you cannot anymore. I hope you find this good news. It has just one modern JavaScript engine. So when you are building your interfaces with buttons, sliders, and stuff, this is in charge of the modern JavaScript engines, very much like it was with CEP. But now also the scripting is dealt with the same modern JavaScript engine. So ExtendScript is finally gone. You can write modern JavaScript syntax, and the engine is very, very fast. The ecosystem is simpler. For instance, you don't have any more those fancy installers, ZXP installers that you may wanted to code sign with expensive code certificates. The developer tool is nice, fine. There is a UXP products marketplace backed by Adobe. And recently they added the possibility to write hybrid plugins. That is to say, if you know C++ and you need C++, you can write your own libraries to make faster calculations for some things, and then hook into those libraries through your UXP plugin. Just to give you an example, for instance, if you want to write XMP metadata, there are XMP specifications, and if you feel inclined, You could write your own C++ XMP parser and then just use that into your plugin and do metadata wonders in your products. Just an idea. Lastly, UXP is extensively used, as I said before, by first party. So expect more and more features to be implemented as UXP plugins. Nowadays in Photoshop, you have, again, the welcome screen for sure, a new file dialog, save as, neural filters, and more things are surely coming. Okay, but there are downsides for sure, because we're humans. We like to find those everywhere. First of all, you shouldn't compare UXP to CEP at all. Otherwise, you're going to get pissed big time. CEP was a standard and much larger and feature-rich environment compared to UXP. So if you do this kind of comparison, you're going to always point out stuff that existed in CEP and not in UXP, or not yet in UXP. For one thing, there is no Node.js, so if you relied on Node to perform some tasks, now you have to find alternatives. And only subsets of HTML and CSS are available. So there are elements, HTML elements you cannot use in UXP or cannot yet use. For instance, the canvas is the one that comes to mind, although canvas is going to be introduced sometime in 2023. But also many CSS properties are not available in UXP, or not going to be in the foreseeable future. Some will, I don't know. In the UI department, if you want to complain, and in this case I will, there could be room for improvement. The UI is built through Spectrum components. So Spectrum, if you're not familiar with it, and I believe I have a video about it, is the Adobe design system that they use in their applications and various websites to different extents. So the idea is that instead of using a standard HTML button, you're using a Spectrum button that comes pre-styled and with some APIs and features. And this holds true for buttons, for sliders, for text fields, whatever, you name it. Now, there are some of those Spectrum elements that, how can I say, don't behave as they are supposed to, or to the extent that one should assume. And also there is some confusion about the kinds of Spectrum components that are implemented, that are going to be implemented in UXP. At the moment, we just have Spectrum UXP, but there are many different flavors of Spectrum components, Spectrum web components that I'm told that are going to land in UXP in the future. Then there are React Spectrum. It's a bit confusing at best. And next in the list of complaints, there is this slow adoption rate. And I'm not specifically talking about third-party developers. And let me open a parenthesis here. The developers experience team in Adobe has done a ton of excellent work, at least since UXP was presented publicly, and even prior to that. We've got conferences and meetings and a lot of documentation and presence in public forums. So kudos to them compared to the previous at least 5 years of complete stillness. This is just a breath of fresh air. I was complaining about, well, not actually I, but I've talked to people who were kind of suspicious about the slow adoption rate of UXP in Adobe applications. So we have Photoshop that is full in, well, Adobe XD was the first, but was kind of a guinea pig application. And InDesign is showing some support now for third-party developers, but a ton of other major applications, seem to be on the fence, still using CEP, but not allowing UXP to third parties. So some malicious people are kind of, being suspicious about this whole thing. As in, you want us to believe in UXP, but you're not showing to believe in the technology yourself. Anyway, and lastly, and this might sound a bit harsh. I don't intend to be, because I'm a big fan of UXP. But one could say that it would be expected to have more progress at this stage in the UXP environment, because we are like more than 2 years of public support, and I would believe at least, I don't know, but it seems fair to imagine that it's been at the very least 2 years in the work behind the scenes. So we have like 4 years of Adobe work on UXP. And thinking about 4 years, there are some things that could be more robust / advanced. Maybe, I don't know. That was just a thought. Okay, back to actual features of the UXP environment. There is UXP Scripting, which is, as I said before, the replacement of the ExtendScript engine. And you can now use scripts not only in the context of a UXP plugin, but as a standalone script. The very same way that you had JS6 files before, now you have PS.js for Photoshop and ED.js for InDesign. Pros, well, this is much simpler. You don't need to scaffold an entire UXP plugin in order to run some script code. And also, scripts can have their own user interface, although that would be a modal dialog as opposed to a modeless panel. And if you're confused by these terms, a modal dialog is a dialog that pops up and you have to interact just with it. You cannot click elsewhere, otherwise Photoshop will beep. And a modal-less panel instead can stay there. You can just click in it and then do stuff elsewhere, and that's perfectly fine. So scripting, modal dialogues versus UXP plugins, modal-less, and also modal dialog as well. Cons, well, scripting in UXP is, because of the fact that they use a entirely different engine, modern JavaScript engines, are incompatible with ExtendScript. You cannot just take some ExtendScript code, copy and paste it inside a PS.js file and expect it to work. It won't. The syntax is different, but also the document object model in some cases is different. I'm going to touch that in a minute. Also, the developer tool support is still a bit green, I must say, so there's room for improvement in that department as well. And it's available only in Photoshop, that also supports UXP plugins, and InDesign, just scripting support at the moment. Okay, I've mentioned the Photoshop DOM. Let me go down this rabbit hole for a moment. If you remember from a previous slide, I told you that Photoshop is based on this event system carrying payloads. And it's not a mystery that Photoshop DOM is an abstraction layer on top of this event system and actually on the batch play now, previously known as Action Manager code, scripting code that deals with those events. So to give you an example, when you, create a layer, then a make event is fired. I believe it's make. If it's not make, that's not the point. An event is fired, and then a descriptor object is created alongside with this event with information, for instance, about the name of the layer or the blending mode of the layer, and so on and so forth. So the DOM is a thick layer of safety measures and logic on top of that lower level code. Now you must know that the Photoshop team has taken the chance of the UXP transition to completely revise and actually rewrite from the ground up the Photoshop DOM. So UXP scripting is not only different compared to ExtendScript because of the modern language, but the structure of the DOM is different as well. Incidentally, this means that the UXP DOM is also more up-to-date and in sync with the current Photoshop features. ExtendScript wasn't updated in a while, let's say, but this difference between the old and the new DOM is not something that should be expected for every application. For instance, I'm told that the UXP DOM in InDesign is pretty much the same. To sum up, Photoshop DOM, new thing. Keep an eye on the changelog page where new features are posted. each month or so, I believe. And now that my contract as an external vendor has expired, I can publicly tell that I have been part of that work, building the new DOM, and it's been a great pleasure and honor for me. Okay, let's now move on to something else that I would like you to notice. That is the fact that you're going to always have to deal with at least two different things. The UXP API on the one side and the host application, InDesign, Photoshop, Illustrator, whatever API on the other. So it's always going to be two of them, two things that you have to learn. And it's very important that you have this distinction clear in your mind. UXP API is related to the panels within this plugin, the various commands, the logic, the elements, the buttons, the sliders, the fact that when you move a slider at some point, something else changes in the panel. This is the UXP API, right? Instead, the hook with the host application, Photoshop, the scripting, are going to be the host application API, the Photoshop API, the special features. For instance, the recently introduced imaging API. All those are part of the host app API. So many developers approach UXP and they learn how to make those panels and all those fancy stuff. And at some point, they get to realize that they have no idea how to script the application, so they're stuck and basically back to square one. So in your learning process, just keep those two learning paths as even as possible, right? And now let's talk about the stuff that you can actually build with this UXP technology. So you can make UXP plugins. A plugin is a collection of one or more panels with a simple or fancy UI that's up entirely to you, and or one or more commands. A command is just a function that you run that doesn't necessarily have a user interface. You can have UXP hybrid plugins where you write your own C++ library, adding a hook so that your hybrid plugin can call that for specific purposes. For instance, processing a large amount of data faster. C++ is preferred for tasks like that. And finally, you have UXP scripts that are simpler. Usually you don't have all the overhead of a UXP plugin that can also have optionally a user interface. You can do UXP plugin, hybrid plugins, scripts, or pay somebody else to do them for you. That's always an option. So I hope that at this point you have a clearer idea of the territory. Let's talk now about the stuff to learn. And I'm going to split that into stuff that you have to learn absolutely or not absolutely. So in this category goes JavaScript. So the language, the features, also the programming logic. This is something that the more you know about, the better. You shouldn't get too much anxious about it, because at some point you will realize that you're going in circles like a vulture around and around the same topics, each time understanding them a little bit more. That's totally fine. This was my experience as well. The good part is that you can learn the modern version of JavaScript, ES6+, if you will. ES stands for ECMAScripts, which is the standard name of the specification. Of course, you will need HTML and CSS as well. The good part is that you're going to need just a subset of them. And for the interface, you're going to use Spectrum components. And also host application scripting. This is paramount. You're not going to go much farther if you don't know how to script the application. You're going to build beautiful facades that actually do nothing. Let me open a parenthesis and talk a little bit about the Alchemist plugin. If you remember that event system that I talked too much at this point about, Alchemist is a Photoshop plugin that allows you to listen to that batch play code, and then it gives it back to you, and then you can do a lot of copy and paste and patch together scripts with that. Very useful. I cannot live without it, but it is intended for an advanced audience, in my opinion. So you make very cautious use of it if you're not experienced. Use the DOM when possible, much safer. and avoid this trap where you just record everything and then you patch it together. It has a high risk of failure, because with the DOM, you can just control more of the logic and build more safety around your scripts. With Bashplay, it's very easy. Bashplay, hence the output of the Alchemist plugin. It's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot. Okay, and then there is stuff to learn eventually in the future, maybe not. For instance, JavaScript frameworks. You can just use vanilla JavaScript. That's perfectly enough. If you want to embark in yet another learning journey, I would recommend React. This is what Adobe uses for their own plugins. I have no experience of Svelte. I've used Vue, but not in the context of UXP. Might work, I don't know. You can skip TypeScript, even if everybody feels compelled to love it. But again, learn JavaScript first. No need to deal with that. Maybe later, maybe with larger projects. And also fancy developers tools, bundlers, Webpack, whatever. You can just skip those. You're going to get exposed to bundlers, for instance, as soon as you step into any framework of your choice. And then there's stuff that you just need to be aware of their existence. For instance, you don't need installers, notarization, code signing certificates. Finally, you can get rid of those things. C++, if you're watching this video, I believe that you're not going to learn C++, and you shouldn't. It's not really necessary for this kind of extensibility. And Node.js shouldn't get into that as well, unless probably you make use of a JavaScript framework, in which case Node.js is going to drive the automation process for the TypeScript transpiler, the code bundlers, and so on and so forth. So all these things, you can just, read the names and move on. Okay, at some point in the future, you're going to ask yourself the question, how can I monetize my work? A very fair question, by the way. So you've got a few options, and the topmost, in my opinion, is the Adobe Creative Cloud Marketplace, if only because it has a huge audience. So basically, every customer of Adobe can be your customer. And also, it has a built-in licensing system, which means that you can now forget about it. It works out of the box. You don't have to worry about it anymore, which is a godsend if you ask me. It works this way. Each time somebody purchases your product, their Adobe ID is then linked to it. And when they install and try to run it, then the Creative Cloud desktop application is going to cross-check the Adobe ID of the user trying to run your plugin with the list of people who have purchased it. And if there is a match, then they're going to be able to use the plugin, otherwise they won't. Awesome. On the downside, the Adobe Creative Cloud Marketplace is less customizable. It misses some features, for instance, upgrade prices. It's hard to create coupons. Actually, it's not hard. You have to ask Adobe for them. It's not something you can do autonomously. You cannot really deploy at the moment extra assets besides the UXP plugins. There are things that could be better. Also, it requires approval. So each time that you submit a product, it has to undergo a vetting process, which can be a bit strict, especially when it comes to the branding and the wording, the description, And finally, they take 10% on each sale, which can be a lot. If you compare it to other services or not, that's entirely up to you. There are other marketplaces, but in my humble opinion, they're not worth, because usually they are a mess. They are super crowded. Your product gets lost in that sea of junk most of the time. So they are not really curated. I don't know if I could say that the Adobe Creative Cloud Marketplace is actually curated in the sense that only high quality products are present. The fact that they have to undergo a vetting is some form of curation, which is absolutely better than no curation at all, like in other marketplaces. Also, you have the option of selling on your own. which gives you total control, which is awesome. In which case, I would suggest you to use merchants of records, especially if you're based in Europe. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, basically you sub-license them to sell your product, and then you just collect royalties. So you don't have to deal with invoices, with VAT, with GDPR, nothing. They do everything for you. They send you the check, and then you invoice them. So it's them who sell your product to people in the world, and that's awesome. On the downside, selling on your own is a huge and majestic pain in the butt. You have to deal with a lot of things that you would rather avoid. So this is also the reason why I used to have my own store. And by the way, I didn't mention merchants of records. The most common ones, you have Gumroad, you have FastSpring, and you have Paddle. FastSpring is the merchant of records that is used by Adobe themselves under the hood of the Creative Cloud Marketplace. Paddle is a great alternative. Gumroad recently has steeply increased their cut on each sale, which has pissed a lot of customers, myself included. What I was saying. Okay, so selling on your own involves paying attention to a lot of things that you would rather not pay attention to and focus to building products. Reason why I used to have a FastSpring account and then I've closed it. Now all my products are on the Creative Cloud Marketplace. I just sell my courses on Gumroad. That's the reason why I am pissed. Perfect segue to the next slide. Let's talk about the state of my courses, because I know that somebody's going to show up and ask me, hey, what should I use to learn stuff about UXP that you have worked on? So there is the Adobe UXP plugins development with React.js book. This is the most updated one of the whole lineup. It has my full attention and long-term support, so rest assured that this is going to be updated as many times as needed, and it's the one that you should get if you want to use React.js. It's mostly about UXP API and React.js and a little bit about the Photoshop API. So if you remember the distinction between UXP API and HostApplication API that I've talked about in the previous slide, the focus is mostly on the UXP API and this huge topic that is React.js, this huge framework. And also I have to make use to demonstrate things of Photoshop API, but it's not the focus of the course. Let's move to professional Photoshop scripting, which is totally about the Photoshop API. The problem for you now, that is based on ExtendScript only. It took me 2 years to write, so I have a second edition in mind. I want to do it. It's a high priority for me at the moment, unless things change in the future. Hope not in a bad way. So it's what you would need, but at the moment it's useful only if you are working on CEP, which, as I said, is not really what you should do. You should move to UXP. And then there is the HTML panels or CEP course. I'm afraid that one's not going to be updated anymore. I gave him 4 or 5 maybe rounds of updates. But now that CEP is deprecated, it makes no sense for me. I have to focus on other subjects such as UXP. And finally, there is the native JavaScript application course. That one would require an update for UXP as well. If you don't know it, and very few people ever bought it, although I thought it was a very cool project to work on. It's based on the build of an Electron application that communicates with Photoshop through an Adobe Generator WebSocket server that I believe also communicated with a CEP plugin. I don't remember anymore, but it was very cool. It's going to need an update as well, but that's very low priority compared to the other ones. Okay, so last slide, the resources, stuff that you have to look at, or I suggest you to look at. For instance, the IDEs to use. If you're asking which IDE should I use, then stick to Visual Studio Code. Otherwise, just use whatever you are already familiar with. There is the Adobe UXP developer tool. I'm not going to provide a download link. By the way, I'm going to give the link to this presentation with all the links of these resources in the comments below. The UXP Dev tool is gonna be downloadable via the Creative Cloud desktop application, so you can find it there with any, I believe, subscription that you have active with Adobe. The Alchemist plugin by the great and funny Jaroslav Bereza, get that with the caveats that I've talked about, so be careful with it. And from that point on, all these links are official documentation, which ranges from good to great. So the quick start guide for UXP, the UXP API, Photoshop API, samples for scripts and plugins for Photoshop, scripts for InDesign, and the UXP page for Adobe InDesign. Lastly, but not leastly, the Adobe Creative Cloud Developer Forums, which is a great place to hang on with fellow developers. It's patrolled by Adobe engineers as well, so you can ask your questions and learn a lot of stuff. We've done it. Thanks so much for sticking with me for so long. I hope this video has been useful and has informed your decisions in your learning paths. Thanks to all the people who have contributed to this channel with the donation. You have a link in the comments below if you want to join this merry band. And see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Ciao.